Hello, everyone. My name is Dylan Moench, and I am the Legal Representation Director with the Children's Commission. And I'm here today to talk to you about procedural justice in CPS cases. And this presentation is part of the pre-conference materials for our Judicial Trauma Institute scheduled for February 17th and 18th. And the reason why we wanted to include information about procedural justice is because while it's not exactly the same as some of the concepts you'll be learning about in the Judicial Trauma Institute, it's something that reinforces and overlaps with a lot of the things that you'll be learning about. So we've divided this presentation into two parts. The first part will be explaining sort of the basic research that lays the foundations for procedural justice. And then the second part will be explaining those concepts in a little bit more detail and applying them to CPS cases. So what exactly is procedural justice? Well, procedural justice developed from research that showed that the fairness of how cases are handled has an important influence on people's evaluations of their experience in the criminal and civil justice systems. So I want to talk a little bit about trust and confidence in the justice system. So studies have shown that in recent decades, the objective quality measurements of the justice system has improved. And by that, I mean it's become more efficient and more productive, and more tangible benefits like that have had some concrete improvements. However, those objective improvements in the delivery of justice hasn't been matched by a high level of trust and confidence in the system amongst Americans. That trust remains an issue, and many members of the public come to court without a lot of confidence in either judges or the law to be treated fairly and to view those authorities as legitimate. And this is especially true of minority group members. So what procedural justice tells us is that how people and their problems are managed when they're dealing with the court has more influence on whether or not those people can accept and abide by the decisions than the outcome of their cases. And I want to pause there just for a second, because I imagine there are some judges and attorneys with us who may be taken a little bit aback by that, because I think attorneys a lot of times think of themselves in terms of whether or not they got the judge to rule in their favor, whether or not they won or lost the argument. Judges oftentimes think of themselves in terms of whether or not they reached the right decision in the case. So it may be concerning to hear that those may not be as important as you once thought. And it's not that those things aren't important. It's not that they aren't critical and that it's not important to get them right. What the studies do show is that how people view the courts are not as tied to those things as we judges and lawyers may think. So what the studies actually suggest about court practices and how they shape behavior is that when people experience procedural fairness, they're more likely to view the authority as legitimate. And when they're likely to view the authority as legitimate, that increases their acceptance of the court's decisions, it increases their satisfaction with the decision maker, and it increases their ability to cooperate and comply with the court's decisions. And that last one is really crucial because, especially in CPS cases, the primary outcome that everyone is hoping for is for the parents to complete their service plan so that children can be safely reunited. So complying with the court's orders really takes on a special significance in CPS cases. And so what are people looking for to experience this fair procedure so that we can have the beneficial effects of people feeling like they are treated fairly? Well, what they are looking for is they are looking to how they perceive the court really influences and shapes both their views on the court and their subsequent behavior. And the key issue that influences that perception of the courts is how they are treated by the court and the court system. And the key treatment that people are looking for is access to a just procedure in dealing with their case. And as you can see, these things all sort of reinforce and influence each other. When someone experiences a just procedure, it influences how they are treated, and that in turn influences their views and their behavior. So how do we know that procedural justice is tied to these outcomes? Well, there was a California study that measured how people felt about the decisions in their court case. And they identified whether or not people felt like the court decision was favorable to them. Did they get what they wanted? They measured whether or not they felt the decision was fair. Did they get the outcome that they deserved? And they measured whether or not people felt the decision was fair. In other words, were they treated in fair ways, and was the decision made in fair ways? And then they measured these associations that people had to their willingness to accept and abide by the court's decisions. And what you can see is outcome favorability and especially outcome fairness were not as strongly correlated with accepting and abiding by the court's decision as experiencing procedural fairness was. And as you can see, it's a significant difference. People will have much stronger connection to abiding by the court's decision when they experience procedural fairness. And further studies revealed that this was true regardless of whether or not you were a plaintiff bringing a problem to court, and it was true whether or not you were the defendant being brought to court by the plaintiff. It was true whether or not the issue was traffic or small claims court. It was true in family court, criminal court, and civil court. It was even true for attorneys, although as you can see, attorneys were much more likely to value outcome favorability and outcome fairness higher than other groups, but they still valued procedural fairness more than they valued outcome fairness and outcome favorability. And the studies also showed that trust and confidence in the court system can actually increase even when people receive a negative outcome if they felt like they received a fair procedure. And that, again, may be something that's very counterintuitive. How can receiving a negative outcome result in an increase in trust and confidence? Well, what I want to make sure people understand is this does not suggest that people are happy if they lose a case or receive an undesired outcome. But what it does show is that procedural fairness can sort of minimize the idea of winning or losing and shift the focus away from those concepts. It suggests that people also recognize that they can't always get what they want and they can't always win every case. And they're much more willing to accept losing if they view the procedure that arrived at that decision as fair. So once they experience this level of fairness, the studies also show that people are likely to continue to abide by the court's orders, and that effect can be quite long lasting. An Australian study found that people convicted of drunk driving who perceived their treatment by the court as fair were 75% less likely to reoffend than those who perceived their treatment as unfair, and that effect extended 4 years after the hearing. A California study that we talked about earlier recognized that people's willingness to accept decisions of police and judges in Oakland found that the primary factor in their willingness to accept the decisions was the perceived fairness of the court proceedings, and importantly, this was true irrespective of their social or economic background. And this is another really key finding of procedural justice. Is what it showed is that what people consider to be a fair procedure is true across ethnic and minority groups. Now, that doesn't mean those groups all report experiencing the same level of fairness. A lot of minority groups reported experiencing less fairness in the system. But what they consider to be a fair experience is actually the same across minority groups, and there is the same correlation between experiencing fairness and accepting and complying with the court's decision across different minority groups. So what makes a procedure fair? Well, again, they studied this and they try to identify what different concepts people associated with fairness. And as you can see, outcome favorability did not rate highly, nor did outcome fairness. But the concepts of voice, respect, neutrality, and trust were all highly correlated with what people associated with a fair procedure and experiencing procedural fairness. And so in part 2 of the video, we're going to go into those concepts in more detail and explain how they apply to CPS cases and how courts can use those concepts to enhance people's experience of procedural fairness in their court.